The next speaker is Mr. Jason Clay, Senior Vice President, Markets and Executive Director of the Markets Institute of WWF. WWF is one of the leading environmental NGOs in the world. The title of Mr. Clay's presentation is The Role and Potential of Business. Mr. Clay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Today I want to speak about the global context of business and biodiversity. The Oromo of Ethiopia have a saying, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. The largest threat to biodiversity yesterday, today, and most likely tomorrow is where and how we produce food and fiber. The expansion of food production, or as some call extensification of agriculture, and I would say agricultural sprawl, needs to be halted. It needs to be frozen in its tracks. We can do this through sustainable intensification, but we've also got to link that to ecological intensification within and around those production areas. As the saying goes, the only constant is change, and we're in a period with more rapid change than ever before. And there are a few key aspects of this change that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this topic. Today we have 7 billion food experts on the planet, and they don't agree on anything, and they certainly don't agree on the science. As a wise man once said, you can have your own opinion, but you can't have your own science. We have got to start creating consensus, building common ground in the middle of very contentious issues. Extremes are good. They inform debates. But we've got to begin to figure out how to solve problems. The world is also smaller than ever before because of communications, because of transportation, and because of electronics. A photo taken of any supply chain anywhere in the world is on a website in minutes and linked to every company that uses that raw material, not just the ones that actually bought it. This is affecting how we have to think about actions and how companies, I think, are beginning to think about actions. But here's the context. We have 7 billion people. Today, they use about 1 unit of consumption each, which gives us 7 billion units of consumption. By 2050, we're going to have at least 9 billion, probably closer to 10, and they're going to consume twice as much per capita as today. That's 18 billion units of consumption. Today, we're living at about 1.5 planets, so we're living off the resource base at a pace faster than it can replace itself, than it can renew itself. If we're going to get to 2050, we're going to have to shrink the impacts associated with each unit of consumption by 62%, the land, the water, the fertilizers, the pesticides, every single input, by 62% to stay where we are today at 1.5 planets. If we want to get to 1 planet, it's going to have to be 75% or more. That's how we shrink it to get where we need to be. I mentioned the speed of change. It took Britain 155 years to double GDP with 9 million people. It took the US 53 years to double GDP with 10 million people. It took China 12 years to double GDP with 1 billion. India, 17 years to double GDP with 822 million. The speed of life has changed forever. What India did and what China is doing is lifting massive numbers of people out of poverty. I would argue that they're not yet in the middle class, but they're certainly out of poverty. But they're still 1 meal away from going back into poverty. So we have to be thoughtful about that. This is a fantastic thing. This is what every government should try to do. But it also has implications for how much people are consuming and what they're consuming. Years after China doubled GDP, the impact of that began to hit commodity markets. So from 95 to 2006, we started to see price rises. And that led to price spikes. India doubled GDP ending in 2006. Is India's impact on commodity prices going to be the same in 12 to 18 years? Who's thinking about that? Who's looking at that? Well, companies are actually beginning to look at that because that's going to affect their business. Whether there is raw material available, what it costs, where it's going to come from, who's producing it, all of those things are affected by this increased demand. The increased demand also led to price spikes in food, which led to deaths in food riots in more than 20 countries and which sparked the Arab Spring. We are living in a world that's more fragile, more on the edge economically and nutritionally than it's been in the past. Shocks have impacts, and this is just one of them. And you're seeing this, the fallout of this as part of the influx of people into Europe. This is one of the longer-term consequences. But here's the challenge, and this is why a group like WWF and other environmental groups are really beginning to think about food. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. And we've got to do it on this planet. There's not any other available. So food production is already the biggest threat. And if you want to think about indicators and what you need to start managing and what we need business cases for and what we want to measure and monitor and improve, I would say these are a few of the key issues. Food production is the largest cause of biodiversity loss and ecosystem service change. Uses 70% of all the water used by people on the planet. Uses more chemicals than any other industry activity, human activity on the planet. Produces more pollution, air and water. Is one of, if not the largest, all-in land use change, etc., greenhouse gas contributors, and has resulted in the loss of about half of the topsoil on the planet in the last 150 years with mechanized agriculture. So the issue going forward is not what to think, it's how to think. A university speaker that I heard a couple of years ago said to the graduating class, 80% of what you've learned is already outdated. How to learn will never be outdated. So we have to focus on the how to learn rather than the what has to be known. So where do companies focus? Do they focus on what they control on scope 1 and 2 issues? Or is the bigger focus on scope 3 or 4 issues? This is an example of Tetra Pak, the greenhouse gases in their supply chains. If they want to reduce the greenhouse gases embedded in their products, they work with the suppliers and they change the way they design their materials and sell to customers so that they can be recycled. They also have to work on what they do themselves, but that's going to be tiny. It's only 7% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And that figure is actually probably a little bit on the high side of what companies actually touch in terms of the impacts of their value chain, whether it's biodiversity, water use, land use, etc. Companies are beginning to see that they need to manage not just the raw material supplies, but the risk and the long-term impacts on production and consumption, really, of their value chains. This is the US, but it's not dissimilar to other places. To promote political security, we have focused on reducing the cost or keeping the cost of food down through subsidies and other means. And yet, even with cheap food, almost 1 billion people go hungry, and the numbers of stunted children are stubbornly high. We're not getting rid of them. Half of farm families today don't produce enough cash and food crops to feed themselves. their own families. They are the malnourished. In fact, if you wanted to be cynical about it, you could say just move farmers to cities because cities have far lower malnourishment rates than rural areas. Another thing that I think we have to take seriously and think about is where do we focus in the system? A lot of us, NGOs and others, governments, companies, have focused on how do we reward the better producers? That's what certification, that's what eco-label verification, production against standards is all about. But in fact, most of the better producers that win that recognition are already better producers, and the changes they have to make are probably minimal. Some probably none at all, others a little bit more. But if you look at the bottom quarter of this performance curve, that bottom 25% produces 50% of the impacts. The reason that all of us care about any specific commodity, and only 10% of the product comes from them. So if you want to increase productivity overall, globally, if you want to reduce environmental impacts, you focus on the bottom. You don't focus on the top. If you focus on the top, it's to learn how to do things better, document the business case, and then work with governments and others to help move the bottom, help shift the whole performance curve. Another thing we have to start thinking about, and companies are certainly beginning to do this as they're switching where they buy their products, anticipating where they think raw materials are going to be produced in the future. Climate change will have a big impact on agriculture. This is a map of where cocoa is produced in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, about 70% of the world's production. This is today. 15 years from now, this is the map of what's going to be suitable for cocoa production. Cocoa is a tree crop. It produces on old growth. So you've got to plant a tree, you've got to let it grow. We haven't got a lot of time in 15 years to find better genetics to adapt to climate change, diseases that come about because of stress, etc. In the short term, climate-smart agriculture is about being efficient, just doing everything better, trying to tighten it up. In the medium term, it's either about getting better genetics, better planting materials, or changing the crop entirely. I don't know how many of you have worked with farmers, but if you have a farmer that has a tree crop, it's very hard to get them to rip it out, even if it's not producing as well as it used to. Who is going to pay for the 2 to 3 years of livelihood they need while that tree is growing before it starts producing sufficiently? Wealthier producers can change crops, can buy expertise, get access to extension. Poor farmers have a much tougher time on that. This is a time bomb for small farmers. This is a time bomb for people growing tree crops. We're going to have to figure out how to finance this transition. And we're going to have to do it through global supply chains, and certainly at a global level. By 2050, we're going to need to double net food availability. Doesn't mean double production. It means double the amount of food that's available to consumers. And there's no silver bullet. We're going to need to do it through productivity and efficiency and waste reduction and shifting consumption. And we need indicators around each of these. And we need to begin to measure it, and we need to begin to manage it, and we need to do it not just company by company, but sector by sector. We have to stop trying to maximize one thing, whether it's just greenhouse gas emissions, or just water use, or just water effluent, or just biodiversity, to optimizing several. We've got to figure out how to measure and manage these things together, because they are part of the same system. One of the things we need to do is rebuild soil. Instead of expanding, instead of agricultural sprawl around the world, can we intensify the areas that we're already using? Can we get more out of the soils? Can we rebuild those soils? Can we use carbon sequestration, soil carbon, as the metric for rebuilding soils? We've set a target with the World Bank of 250 million hectares by 2030. That could produce about 10% of the world's food, just on that land. We need to figure out how to reduce the amount of water that's used to produce food. This is today's rate. It comes to about 1 liter of water per 1 calorie. Can we cut it in half and double the productivity? Half a liter, 2 calories. That's what it's going to take to get to 2050 within one planet. That kind of efficiency. And waste. We waste 1 in 3 calories today. That's 50% of the new food we'd need to produce by 2050. But given how much water is used for agriculture, just the amount that's wasted is 23% of all the water used by people for any activity. And because of ag's relationship to greenhouse gas emissions, food waste itself represents 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Ag is about 29% all in with land use change. That means 10% is for food that is not fed to people, cars, or cattle. It's just wasted. So on a finite planet with boundaries, should consumers have a choice about sustainable products, or should all the products on the shelf be sustainable? That's kind of the question. And if you think all the products should be sustainable, then it's not so much about certification programs and about differentiating product. It's about how to shift the whole sector so that every product is sustainable. And that's where I think some progressive companies, and you'll hear from some of them, Young Case on this panel and others, talking about what individual companies are doing. But one by one by one is not fast enough. We have got to start working with platforms of companies, whole sectors, to shift. So, how do we shift this kind of sustainability from niche markets to become the norm? And here's what a few companies are doing. I'm sure Young Case will talk about what Unilever is doing themselves, because they're probably the most progressive of what any company is doing individually. But the Consumer Goods Forum has made a commitment. This is now, I think, last I heard, is 57, 58 companies have made a commitment to take deforestation out of supply chains. And what they've focused on is 4 commodities, 2 countries, which is half of tropical deforestation. The Salmon, Global Salmon Initiative, 17 of the world's largest salmon aquaculture producers, 70% of the world's market, have agreed to share all their data about impacts, about investments to reduce them, make it all public, have it third-party reviewed and audited so that they can learn faster. And the reason they did this is that the better companies realized that the reputation of the entire sector was dependent on the performance of the worst players. And so if they wanted to have license to operate, if they wanted access to markets, they had to raise the entire sector, not just one company. And so their first report came out in September about what their baseline is against key impacts. And they have pledged to be certified against credible global standards by 2020. I just came from Ireland for the last 2 days, where Board B and the Irish government have made a commitment that 100% of food exports from Ireland will be third-party certified against credible sustainability standards. They're not going to get there. It's by 2016, which is just next year. But they have about 80% of producers in the system giving data to the government about environmental performance. And they're starting to measure, they're starting to set up databases to share information. This is the first country that has ever made a commitment like this. And it wasn't easy. Farmers don't like to share data, especially with governments. So the issue for all of these companies, for these platforms and these producers, is about risk. It's about risk of raw material supply, but it's also about reputation. And the two are kind of weighing equally and each pushing forward. As they say, where I come from, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We have to reduce the impacts of production and consumption. There's no silver bullet. We can't focus on everything, and we can't afford to focus just on one thing. But the business case for change is going to be key, and we have to start documenting that and communicating that. We have to focus on the productivity and the efficiency side, and also the waste and the consumption side. We need to be defining a key set of KPIs about performance, key performance indicators, and then measuring and managing them. Thank you very much.